Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 7th of March. And we are on the cusp of spring break, as you probably know. So what I wanted to do this week was to put some closure onto writing papers, which I had talked about last class, and begin our new unit with drama. As you know, Mother Nature has had a few surprises for us, but I believe that we can catch up certainly after the spring break. So I encourage you to keep up with the reading, even though we might have fallen a little bit behind. And I had given an extension for both your first journal, which was on short story, and also your first paper, which is on short story. Ideally, you would submit in that first paper this upcoming Thursday, and that's the 9th, because next week is spring break. So better for everybody involved if you can get that paper in before the spring break. That said, if you needed additional time, you could always ask me for an extension, and then we could negotiate. In terms of the first paper, I had asked you an attendance question about what you thought some of your challenges might be. And for today's attendance question, actually, it will be directly addressing that first paper. If you've got any questions or concerns, and if so, what are those questions and concerns? If it turns out you don't have any questions or concerns, you can just say, I have no questions. That'll satisfy the requirements for the attendance question. But since the paper will be due on Thursday at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, this would be a good time for you to raise any questions that you might have about the paper. If you remember last class, I talked a little bit about some of the suggestions I have for going through the process of writing a paper, as well as documentation. Since you aren't doing a research paper, you're not required to submit in a works cited page. That said, if you do submit in a works cited page, you want to make sure that it's done correctly. And a couple of the places that I recommend for you to access information about documentation, and you can see this in the notes below under documentation. The first is Purdue OWL, which is a great website from Purdue University that's available to everyone, whether they're registered at Purdue or not, that talks about the entire writing process, including documentation. Our GCC library too, and I've included the link that will take you directly to the GCC library writing and citation guides. As you know, we are using the MLA, the Modern Language Association, which is the system that you use in the languages and the humanities. English is a language, so we would be using the MLA system, where we use parenthetical documentation. We use parentheses at the ending of a quote in order to indicate the location of where to find that particular quote. And we try to be as simple as possible and as concise as possible. So what that would mean in the simplest and most concise form is that in the parentheses after the quote, and it doesn't matter whether you have finished your sentence or not, immediately after the quote in the parentheses, you would indicate something like page number. And you wouldn't have to write the word page or PG or anything like that. And again, the system builds on itself. So if the page number is not sufficient because you're using multiple sources, then you might want to include the author's last name and page number. And if you're using multiple sources from the same author, then you might want to include part of the title and the author's last name and page number, and so forth and so on. And all of this comes together on the last page, which is entitled Works Cited, where you list all of the works you've literally cited or quoted from in alphabetical order by author's last name. This is where you give all of the details. Things like publisher, excuse me, place of publication, year, things of that nature. So you would list that information, but only once at the ending of your paper. As I indicated, if you are using the textbook from class, because you're not required to use outside resources, your works cited page, if you included one, would list basically our class textbook and all the corresponding information. I'm assuming that you've already gone through this with your previous English class, so you know how to write a works cited page. So I'm not requiring you to cite our our textbook. You can just cite in parentheses at the ending of any quotes that you use the page number. And that said, you might be comparing and contrasting two stories. If it's unclear as to which story you're referencing, in that instance, you would use the author's last name and the page number. However, again, you might be utilizing outside sources if you've negotiated something like a research paper with me. And if that's the case, then you definitely have to include a works cited page where you are including all of those sources. And in the notes below under documentation, you can see some examples of how you would go through documenting that. Basically, you use the quotation marks to indicate when you are starting and also ending a direct quote. And then immediately after that quote, you open parentheses and then you put in the numeral of the page, close parentheses, and then you've got your ending punctuation. That's the first example. Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college. The second example is where a quotation is embedded within a longer sentence. And in this particular instance, as I had indicated, you put the parentheses immediately after the quote, and then you continue your sentence. So in this instance, it's, quote, although Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote. And then in parentheses 162, you continue your sentence. He cannot pray with his mother. And then you've got your ending punctuation. You can insert your own language into a quote by using square brackets, not parentheses, square brackets. We do so usually to clarify something. It's comparable to interrupting somebody when they're speaking, so you want to avoid it. So if you're doing this, it has to be very important. It's not just commenting on the significance of the quote. Usually what you're clarifying is a pronoun, which might be unclear based on the selection that you have used in your paper. It wouldn't be necessarily unclear in the story itself. The example I gave you was, quote, even his, and then a square bracket, Krebs's, close bracket, lies were not sensational. And basically, the word Krebs was not part of the original quote. I inserted that in to make it very clear that his was in reference to Krebs rather than to another male character in the story, such as Krebs's father, for instance. And you can also omit part of a quote. It's called an ellipsis. And you would do so if it's something that's irrelevant. You wouldn't do so to change the meaning of the quote. That would be basically unethical. And you don't need to begin or end a quote with an ellipsis because the assumption is that there was lots of content before you decided to begin your quote. There's lots of content after you've decided to end your quote. But between the starting and the ending point of where you've decided to start and end your quote, if you leave out something in the middle of those 2 points, you would use what's fondly known as the 3 periods or the ellipsis. That means a word or several words have been deleted. The example I give you is, quote, during this time, period, quote, was sleeping late in bed. And the sentence begins with Krebs, comma, quote, during this time, period, or ellipsis, was sleeping late in bed, unquote. So in this instance, I've left out a word or several words that might not be considered relevant. And of course, there's the Purdue OWL website, there's the GCC library website. And I think I also talked about block quotes. If you've got a long quote that's over 3 lines of text, not 3 sentences, 3 lines of text, then you would block it off. Basically, you would indent it inward so that it looks like a block. And then it's very clear to the reader where you're starting and ending your quote. You don't use quotation marks in this instance. That's considered to be redundant. And in this instance, punctuation comes before parenthetical documentation, not afterwards. Our textbook as well, if you'll remember some of our earlier readings at the start of the semester, also talks about the conventions of quoting and also the process of writing a paper. But again, if you've got any particular questions, you can always raise them with me as well. So I hope that you are in the midst of your paper while I'm beginning to talk about drama. Drama is a very different kind of animal than short story. One of the things that you want to keep in mind is that dramas are meant to be performed, which means that we will be watching performance as well. I wish we were watching live performance, which is the way that you should be watching a drama or a play. And these words are used basically interchangeably. And I love that idea that a drama is play. And if you think about play, there's an element of pretend and an element of imagination and fun associated with it. So that we can't do is see a live performance. We can see filmed performances that will be better than nothing, but certainly it's not the same as being live somewhere with the electricity of the moment, where it becomes an event in effect when you're watching something live, partly because you don't know what'll happen. Anything can happen because it's live, it hasn't been edited. And also, when you are watching something that's filmed, your attention is being directed by the camera, as opposed to when you are in a live audience and you are deciding where to put your attention. Albeit, there might be techniques used for the stage, such as lighting, to try to encourage you to focus on a particular area. But certainly, we have much less control when we're watching something that's live. And we also are going to be reading these plays, because these plays, even though they were meant to be performed, are also great literary examples. So we can analyze and interpret them in the way that we've analyzed and interpreted short story, and the way that we will do so with poetry at the ending of the semester. For reading a drama, and keep in mind that watching a performance is merely a supplement to reading, it's never a substitute to reading, because this is a literature class, so eventually we will be writing about the dramas themselves, a journal, and also eventually a paper. But with reading drama, a couple of tips. Make sure you pay careful attention to those stage directions. Those are the only hints or clues we have as to how the drama would be performed. Make sure you pay very close attention to the characters and who is speaking. When you become involved in the plot, you might be very tempted to skip the character names and just go straight to the dialogue. Dramas are almost entirely dialogue based. Don't do that. Pay attention to who is speaking and try to visualize that person. Obviously, this would be much easier if we were watching a performance, because we could see the actor. So obviously, different actors have different physical appearances, different wardrobes, things of that nature. But we want to be able to differentiate from one character to another. And probably our most common experiences with seeing drama are through television. And of course, these are filmed. And in terms of television, we have different genres, much like we have different genres with formula fiction. And much of television is formulaic. And it's because it's meant to appeal to a wide audience. It's meant for entertainment and escapism. And it's meant to generate profit. And as we talked about with Harlequin romances, there's nothing wrong with any of those elements. However, sometimes what you can find is television that has a great depth and complexity to it, in addition to the fact that it's formulaic. And I think a wonderful example, if you've ever seen the television show Breaking Bad, I've always argued that Breaking Bad is really a retelling of Oedipus the King, which happens to be the first drama that we are going to be examining in our drama section. But nevertheless, just to give you an idea of the difference between reading a script as opposed to watching it performed live, you'll note that in our textbook, they gave you a script or a partial script from a television drama that you might have heard of before. And basically, this instance, it's not a drama, it's a sitcom, a situation comedy, which has particular rules that you follow. Because when we use the word drama on television, we're usually talking about a serious event. When we talk about drama in terms of performance, we're just talking about performance or a play, and we're not necessarily talking about the tone. The tone could be serious, but it need not be serious, as we will see with Shakespearean drama when we read and see A Midsummer Night's Dream, which happens to be a comedy. But in this instance, you might be familiar with the 1990s comedy Seinfeld. In terms of television history, it was the time where probably we would get the largest audiences ever watching one program simultaneously. Keep in mind that the internet was in its infancy, and we didn't have streaming options in the way that we do now. So it was an interesting time culturally, the 80s and the 90s in particular, because you would have large audience segments consuming the same program at the same time, which is both good and bad. The good part is that it kind of led to a kind of cultural shorthand where everybody had something in common because they were all experiencing something. But I talk about this in my media class, actually. But nevertheless, in terms of Seinfeld, what they've done is they've given you a piece of the script, And then what I've done, as you can see in the notes below, is I've given you a piece of that script, just about 3 or 4 minutes or so, actually performed, so that you can see the difference between watching a performance rather than just reading it. Now, if you've never heard of Seinfeld before, you are at the biggest disadvantage because you really don't know anything about the show or the characters. It's a recurring sitcom. Now, if you know something about the show Seinfeld, but you've never watched it, you have a small advantage, but you wouldn't have as much of an advantage as somebody who's actually seen the show Seinfeld, because obviously they are familiar with the actors and the premise. And if you actually happen to see the episode that's highlighted in our textbook that's entitled The Pitch, then you have the most advantage because you know exactly what is going to be happening before you actually even read that script. But I encourage you to watch this 3 or 4 minutes of Seinfeld and compare it to just the flat nature of reading, because there are two huge differences between the two. Usually what I would do is I would actually read you part of the script. I'm just going to skip that because we've fallen a little bit behind because of some snow days. But obviously when you've got skilled actors, and these are skilled actors, it's all about the vocal inflections and the settings and so forth. And when we move forward to talk about the elements of drama, you can expect that dramas are going to be much longer than what we saw with short stories. And they oftentimes are divided up into pieces because of their length, known as acts. Those are the main divisions in a play. The early plays don't necessarily have those divisions when we talk about the very, very early days of drama, such as Oedipus the King. But certainly when we get to Shakespeare, we will see this. In fact, we can predict that Shakespeare plays will have 5 acts, and they will follow a particular pattern, which is kind of interesting about Shakespeare in that his plays were oftentimes formulaic, but that didn't necessarily mean that they were formula fiction, because ultimately they had depth and creativity to them. But of course, Shakespeare would break all of the rules. And within those acts, some of the acts could be long enough to require scenes. Those are additional divisions within acts for new locations or the introduction of new characters. And you oftentimes have subplots as well, not just a main plot, not just one story, but multiple stories occurring at the same time, all reflections of one another. And as I had indicated, you'll have stage directions. These are the playwright's instructions to the actors, to the director, about how this should be performed. So you want to pay particular attention to those stage directions. And you could expect a kind of pyramid structure to drama, a rising and a falling of action, where at the lower left-hand side of the pyramid, this is the introduction to characters, and then there's ascent as conflict is beginning to increase until you get to the point or the top of the pyramid, the tip. This would be the height of conflict, and then you've got descent. And again, when we get to Shakespeare, it's so predictable that we can even know what act is going to employ what technique. So Act 1 would be at the bottom of the left-hand side of the pyramid. Act 2 would be the beginning of the ascent. Act 3 would be the tip of the pyramid, the height of the conflict. Act 4 would be on the right-hand side, the beginning of descent. And Act 5 would be at the bottom of the right-hand side, and that would be resolution. And we're even given some questions about writing drama on writing about drama on pages 1115 to 1116. The good news is that many of these questions are very similar to the sorts of questions we would ask ourselves with short story. So asking questions about title, for instance, or symbolism, for instance, or tone, for instance, or character development, for instance, or theme. All of those are things that we've talked about with short story. Of course, there'll be some different questions as well, because dramas are ultimately a different animal, as I had indicated, than short story. So thinking about stage directions is something that you would think about with the drama that you wouldn't necessarily think about in a short story. Thinking about subplots is something that you might be thinking about in a drama that you wouldn't necessarily think about in a short story, which addresses a single incident, which is why it's a short story. So those are there to sort of guide your reading. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about Sophocles, who is going to be the author of the first drama we're reading, Oedipus the King, and also watching performed. This is a very old drama, 430 BC. Can you imagine? 430 BC from Greece. Now, we are reading a translation. I don't expect any of us to speak Greek. I don't speak Greek. So in my opinion, I've never read Oedipus the King, nor watched a performance. That said, I've seen many performances and read many editions of Oedipus the King. I've read translations, and I've watched performances that were done in translation, in English, because that's the language that I speak. But as you know, a translation can be a kind of tricky thing when you are translating something from one language to another, because it doesn't necessarily always have the same essence from one language to another. Oedipus is particularly complex because the play was written in poetry. So now there are two things to consider when we're doing a translation. The content, or the plot. Am I finding the right words to give the right sense of the action? But also, poetry is about musicality, which we will talk about. It's about the sounds of words. And the sounds that words make in Greek may not necessarily be the same sounds they make in English. So it's a trade-off when you're doing a translation, and that you're trying to keep to the content and be as accurate as possible in your translation. But you're also trying to keep to the sound or the rhythm as much as possible. And sometimes you can keep to rhythm but not necessarily keep the content, or vice versa. So some translations are better than others, but ultimately for Oedipus the King, perhaps it's less important that we're reading a translation, because the audience would have been expected to know the plot ahead of time. In part, there are certain reasons why it's useful to know the plot, but mostly it's because of the theaters and some of the limitations of a theater in 430 BC, Greek amphitheaters, which is what Sophocles wrote his plays for. Sophocles being from the 400s BC, Athens, Greece. He was a dramatist, but also a statesman and a general, so he did quite a few things. There are over 120 play fragments that are available. A handful are intact. Luckily, one of those includes Oedipus the King, which happens to be a 3-part story, by the way. We're reading just the first part, Oedipus. There's a second play that continues his story. It's called Antigone. I believe it's included in your textbook. And then there's a third part, and that's called Oedipus at Colonus, and it's the story of Oedipus as an old man. But we're just reading the first. And Sophocles was considered to be a rather important dramatist because of some of the ways that he modernized drama for the time. He added a third actor on the stage. At the time, only 2 actors would be on stage. And again, I wanted to mention a Greek amphitheater and how difficult it might be to see actors on stage in a Greek amphitheater. Greek amphitheaters basically could seat thousands of people. They were almost like sports stadiums, and they were carved into the stones of hills. They were marvels of architecture. They had wonderful acoustics. I've never seen a Greek amphitheater live, but I have certainly seen them on video, and I've also read about them. And in fact, if you look at the notes below, you'll see that I have a video about the Greek amphitheater that I'm asking you to watch, that's several minutes long, to give you an idea of what the Greek amphitheater would have looked like during the time period. It's only 4 minutes, but it'll give you an idea of the kind of majesty of it and its limitations. They didn't have electricity, and they didn't have microphones, and they didn't have many of the modern things that we take for granted. So can you imagine sitting all the way in one of the back seats and trying to watch the play? Obviously, it would be very difficult. So it would be very useful that you knew the plot ahead of time, so you weren't reliant on watching the play for knowing plot. The reason why you would watch the play would be for entertainment purposes and also for religious purposes, because as the amphitheater video will talk about, Greek dramas were seen as healing vehicles and also were part of religious festivals, ways to honor the gods in the plural, because this was a society that had multiple gods or believed in multiple gods. Specifically, the god Dionysus, the god of wine and fertility, was honored through the performance of these plays. which I think of in some ways almost like religious sermons, that you already know the story of the religious sermon, but you go to reinforce the morals of that sermon into your understanding. And also you go to see how the new treatment, because each sermon will be done slightly differently depending on who is presenting that sermon. And it's the same with Oedipus the King. Depending on the actors, it'll all be presented differently. But you already know the plot ahead of time. And if there are only two actors on stage, well, then it's fairly easy to differentiate the two actors. Once you add a third actor, which is what Sophocles did, then you've got to pay a lot more attention to differentiate them. Again, it would be difficult to see. And the actors were thought to wear these large masks so that we could see them, or that would help us see them, and that would help to differentiate their characters. The mask would oftentimes denote a particular facial expression, so that could help us differentiate from characters. Or the mask could even be different colors so that we could differentiate between characters. The actors would wear very large padded costuming and platform shoes, again to make them seem larger than life, so that we could see them on stage in that Greek amphitheater. They would also engage in very exaggerated movements. It almost reminds me of a silent film. And again, it might seem very artificial in contemporary times, almost laughable. But if you're sitting in that Greek amphitheater, again, all the way in the back, then those movements would not seem artificial at all. There was also the convention of the time of having something called a chorus, and these would be multiple actors on stage who would basically be chanting their lines. I almost think of the Gregorian chant. Now, during Greek amphitheater performances, there wouldn't have been music in the way that we think of when we think of dramatic performances and soundtracks. But the chorus could provide a kind of musical score in some respects, because they would be chanting and it would be rather musical. They would all be chanting at the same time, which would amplify their volume. That would be helpful. Even though the amphitheaters were marvels in acoustics, there would still probably be some challenges with hearing, especially if the amphitheater was filled with thousands of people. In fact, we think there were even amplification devices in the mass to help again with volume. And if the entire chorus was chanting at the same time, they could represent a large body, the populace, in effect. So they could represent the community. They could respond to the action, almost like the extras in a movie that you might see. And also they could serve as commentators, narration. Keep in mind that what we get in a drama is just about all dialogue, so it's very difficult to give exposition or background information or to discuss mental states in the way you would with a short story, where a character can think something in a short story. That's not so easy to communicate through dialogue. I mean, you can do things like voiceovers and so forth, but ultimately, there are limitations in a drama in a way that you wouldn't necessarily find when you're writing fiction. So all of those things are things to consider when we're watching performances. And the religious festival to Dionysus, the god of wine and fertility, would be funded by the state, because it was thought that these plays reinforce religious and community values. How nice is that, to have the government support the arts? I say somewhat sarcastically. You might know of a term called Deus ex machina, which means God from the machine. And what this basically meant was that these were mechanical stage devices to make, well, for lack of a better word, special effects during the performance of Greek dramas. So there could be things like pulleys, for instance, and ropes. You'll see that in the Greek amphitheater video that I'm asking you to watch. So you could actually lower character onto stage from the heavens, or perhaps you could have a character be raised up into the heavens through ropes and pulleys and so forth. That said, there really wasn't much in the way of special effects in the way that we think of them. Very little in the way of props as well, just because of the difficulties involved with doing all of that in a Greek amphitheater. What Deus ex machina has come to mean now in contemporary times is any artificial means used to give a quick resolution. For instance, a character, or let's say we've invested a lot of time into a story, And then at the very ending, it turns out that the character in the last minute or two dreamt the entire story. That would be an example of Deus Ex Machina, a very artificial way of sort of giving a resolution to a plot line. So, as I had indicated, we should know the plot ahead of time. And the plot for Oedipus the King is quite dark. It is known to be an example, perhaps the greatest example of tragedy. You might know of Aristotle, the great philosopher, who also dabbled in literary criticism. And he identified all of the qualities that should be part of a tragedy and indicated that Oedipus the King was a wonderful example of having all of those qualities. That it's about a great man, somebody above and beyond the ordinary, someone that we can respect, and somebody who experiences a downfall, in part because of their own errors. So that's the instructional element for us as audience, to learn from their mistakes, that we don't duplicate those mistakes. But there's also an outside force, things beyond our control. This might be called a flaw or flaws in character. I'm sorry, their errors are flaws in character, and then those things beyond their control would be an outside force, and we think about those things such as fate or luck or free will. So you've got both, which is very realistic, that we are responsible for our actions. Negative actions result in negative consequences. So the idea is that we should avoid those negative actions. But regardless of our actions, there's still outside forces. Some religions and philosophies will use language like destiny or fate or predetermination. We might even just use the language luck, where you do everything right, but yet something goes wrong. So things that we cannot control. And in Aristotle's definition of a tragedy, illustrated by Oedipus the King, we will see both. Oedipus engages in quite a few flaws in character that we should not duplicate. That's the learning for us. But also there are outside forces beyond his control. Once he experiences this fall, we as audience feel pity and fear. Pity because this was a good man above and beyond the ordinary. So they're not completely to blame. But also fear, because if this could happen to someone like them, it could certainly happen to someone like us. And it could even be a much bigger fall. So the plot of Oedipus the King, because I had indicated that the audience would know the plot, the textbook gives you the plot, and I also want to give you the plot as well. And the play begins in media res. What that means is that it is beginning in the middle of action, where we have Oedipus, who's a king, as you could probably determine from the title, who basically is confronting a plague in his community. Remember, this is 430 BC. And they are convinced that the plague is the cause from offending the gods. So what they need to do as a community is determine how they've offended the gods and to make amends so that they can stop all of the pain and suffering that's going on. So Oedipus sends out lots of individuals from the community to go consult with oracles, which would be very common at the time, to try to find out how it is that they've offended the gods. And the answer is always the same, that it's Oedipus himself who's offended the gods. Oedipus is quite angry and basically accuses individuals of lying or trying to steal his kingdom. He even accuses his own brother-in-law, who he sends out to visit the oracle, of trying to steal the kingdom from him. And because the brother-in-law comes back and says what everybody else says, that Oedipus is at fault. And the brother-in-law, Creon, says, well, this is ridiculous because I have no desire for your kingdom. I have all the benefits of a kingdom by being part of the royal family with none of the responsibilities because I'm not king. But at any rate, as the play progresses, more and more information is revealed, backstory, to explain how Oedipus is indeed responsible for the plague. So how did all of this happen? What do we learn in backstory? What we learn is that this begins with Oedipus's parents. That Oedipus's parents, when they had Oedipus as a baby, consulted the oracle. And the oracle told them that Oedipus would grow up to eventually kill his father and marry his mother. His parents are horrified, decide they have to take action to prevent this. So what they end up doing is deciding that Oedipus must be killed. They give Oedipus the baby to a servant in order to kill Oedipus. But the servant feels pity upon Oedipus, abandons Oedipus on a mountaintop. hoping for the best, which is what perhaps occurs because Oedipus is found by another servant from another community. And it turns out that this community, the king and queen, want children but can't have children. So, of course, the servant brings Oedipus the baby to the king and queen, his king and queen. And they're thrilled and decide to raise the baby as their own biological son. And they never tell the baby that they are not his biological parents, they are his adopted parents. Well, Oedipus grows up to be a man. Eventually, he consults the oracle, and he's told that his fate is to one day kill his father and marry his mother. Oedipus, a good man, is horrified. He doesn't want that to occur, so he decides he needs to take action to prevent it. What he's going to do is to leave his birth home, or what he thinks is his birth home. He is going to leave his father and his mother so that there isn't any possibility of killing his father or marrying his mother. Of course, Oedipus doesn't know that the people he's leaving are not his biological parents. Upon Oedipus's travels, at one point his road is blocked, and in a fit of rage, Oedipus kills the people in the chariot who are blocking his way. It just so turns out, we find out later, that one of those people was Oedipus's biological father. I've had some students wonder why Oedipus would have such a fit of rage. I perhaps had the best explanation years ago in one of my classes when a student volunteered a 2-word expression, road rage, that all of a sudden clarified everything. But definitely this is one of Oedipus's flaws, a quick temper. And it turns out that Oedipus eventually ends up at a community that is being ravaged by plague, this time through a horrible monster called the Sphinx. And we aren't shown any of this on stage because it would be too unrealistic. So that's one of the elements with drama for tragedy that Aristotle identified. You want to try to be as realistic as possible. So if something that is truly unrealistic, like a sphinx, is introduced, then it's talked about or it occurs off stage. At any rate, the only way to defeat the sphinx is to solve its riddle. There's a long literary tradition of this, that you have to solve riddles in order to defeat monstrosity. And the Sphinx's riddle ends up being something that no one can solve except Oedipus. And in fact, I can tell you the riddle. The riddle is what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, 3 legs in the evening. So what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, 3 legs in the evening? The answer is man. 4 legs in the morning would be a child crawling. Morning would represent youth. 2 legs in the afternoon, that would represent adulthood, and that would be walking upright on 2 legs. 3 legs in the evening, that would be old age, represented by the evening, and that would be walking with a cane, 3 legs. Oedipus solves the riddle. And if you knew the answer beforehand, try not to be too arrogant, because that's one of the messages of the play, is to avoid hubris or excessive pride or arrogance. But at any rate, Oedipus solves the riddle, so it just so turns out, coincidentally, that their king has been killed recently. So Oedipus's reward is being given the kingdom and the newly widowed queen, who is, well, you've probably figured it out, Oedipus's biological mother. Not that Oedipus nor the newly widowed queen know this. They marry and they have children. This is how Oedipus has offended the gods. So, once Oedipus comes to the realization that he himself is indeed responsible for the plague, it's quite interesting because everybody figures out the answer before Oedipus himself, which is part of the irony of the play, that Oedipus is blind to the truth, even though we all know it, and all of the characters do. Even Oedipus's mother/wife figures it out, and her before Oedipus does. And her response is just leave it alone. Let everybody in the community suffer so that we can protect ourselves. And Oedipus refuses to do that because he's a good man and he uncovers the truth. And his wife/mother is so horrified she runs off stage because she's going to commit suicide. Again, we couldn't realistically do that on stage. And she does commit suicide. Oedipus runs after her. He finds her dead body. And in grief and in anger, he takes the brooches off of her dress and he gouges out his eyes. He blinds himself, because that's a major theme in the play, vision and blindness, and who can see and who can't see. And at this point, it turns out that at the very ending of the play, Oedipus is now blinded and he is going to be exiled, which would be pretty close to death. at this point, pretty comparable. And the new king happens to be, of all people, Creon, Oedipus's brother-in-law, who said that he never wanted the kingdom, but in an ironic twist, he's the only one left to be king. He shows Oedipus a little bit of mercy because Oedipus wants to say goodbye to his children slash daughters. And Oedipus is particularly concerned with them because they're women. The boys at least can fend for themselves, but who will marry these girls when they turn into women, being the products of incest? And then Oedipus basically wanders off blind. And ironically, on 3 legs, he's not an old man, but he needs a cane, because a seeing eye cane, because he is blind. And that's the ending of Oedipus the King. So I said the story continues with the next play, Antigone, which is the story of one of Oedipus's daughters, who is now an adult. And we revisit Creon the king. Now he's a much older king. And in some ways, he's a very different kind of person. He's very arrogant and blind and self-centered, almost like Oedipus was. So it makes you wonder how the position of being in power changes an individual. And I won't tell you the details of that play. You'll have to read it on your own if you're interested. The third play in the trilogy being 3, is Oedipus at Colonus, where we get to revisit Oedipus as an old man, still wandering around blinded. The question is, has he appeased the gods? Has he suffered enough to make amends for his sins? Again, I won't tell you. You'll have to actually read the play. A play that's very famous because, as Aristotle had said, it helps to define what tragedy is. A play that's also very famous because if you're taking any psychology, you might be familiar with Sigmund Freud and his theory, the Oedipal complex, which Sigmund Freud very, very loosely took from the play Oedipus the King. Freud's Oedipal complex, which has fallen out of favor, states that basically all boys are in competition with their fathers for the love of their mother. Sigmund Freud has another concept called the Electra complex, which works the same way for girls who are in competition with their mothers for their father's attention. Sigmund Freud is all about sex and repressed sexuality, if you know anything about Sigmund Freud. And as I said, his theories have fallen out of favor, but you can see how he very loosely was inspired by the title Oedipus the King to name his complex the Oedipal complex. So now you know where that comes from as well. So that's another reason why this play is so significant. So in terms of next class, what I wanted to do was to show a performance of Oedipus the King that tries to duplicate as much as possible what we would have experienced in 430 BC, at least based on the scholarship that's available. And obviously, we don't have any eyewitnesses to tell us exactly what we would have seen. But we will see a version of the play that will seem very different than any kind of modern-day performance you're accustomed to. We will see those actors wearing masks in those huge costumes with the elevated shoes. We will see the chorus chanting in unison. We will see these exaggerated movements. Again, it's going to seem odd because we're watching it on film, but if we were sitting in a Greek amphitheater, it would seem much less artificial, especially because we wouldn't be accustomed to some of the modern day technologies that we have today. So that will be next class. Again, keep in mind that watching a performance is never a substitute. It's merely a supplement for reading the play. But now you know the plot of the play, much like the audience would have known the plot of the play in 430 BC when they were watching Oedipus. So you can appreciate all of the foreshadowing and all of the irony in a way that you wouldn't be able to if you didn't already know the plot, that Oedipus himself is guilty. But as I said, for today's attendance question, I wanted to revert back to our first paper, which ideally would be due next class before the spring break. And your question is, do you have any questions about paper number 1? And if so, what? If you don't have any questions, you can just say no questions, and that'll satisfy your attendance for this particular class. Next class, I'll briefly do a little bit of an introduction to Oedipus the King, and we'll go into the actual play, Oedipus the King, by watching a performance. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.